The prosecution and defense officially rested their cases in the Sean Combs criminal trial. The defense even tried to get all the charges thrown out before the jury even deliberates. And we hear from Sean Combs himself in open court about whether he will testify. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey everybody, this is another Law&Crime legal alert. If you received Depo-Provera birth control shots and were later diagnosed with a brain or spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. That's right, Morgan & Morgan, they're investigating claims that patients were improperly warned about this risk. It's free to check, just takes a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on screen, click the link below, or go to forthepeople.com/LCDepo to see if you qualify. Okay, we have day 29 of the Sean Diddy Combs federal sex crimes trial, and what a day it was. The prosecution officially rested their case on charges of sex trafficking, racketeering conspiracy, transportation to engage in prostitution. We heard the final testimony of the prosecution's final witness. After that concluded, the defense then argued under Rule 29 of the Federal Rules of Evidence that Combs is entitled to a judgment of acquittal, meaning there was nothing for the jury to decide. They should not be handed the case. There is insufficient evidence to support convictions on these charges. Fascinating arguments made by the defense. We're going to talk about them. And then from there, we heard the defense's case, and it was really, really short. The defense rested their case. So both sides rested their case. Oh, and by the way, how could I forget this? Sean Combs made a decision on whether or not he will testify. Spoke in open court. Actually, complimented the judge, by the way, believe it or not. So we're going to get into everything that happened today. A lot happened today. A lot to get into. Let me bring back on to Sidebar, Law&Crime's in-court reporter, Elizabeth Millner. Elizabeth, so good to see you. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to see each other during the lunchtime show that we always do during YouTube, because let me tell you, from our YouTubers, our viewers, so many compliments for you. So many compliments. And a lot of people worried about you. Worried, are you having enough to eat? Are you getting enough sleep? Are you staying cool in the heat? So many concerned citizens that we have out there for Elizabeth Millner. But Elizabeth, you're doing a great job. Happy to have you on. Okay. So we begin the day with the continued cross-examination of this Homeland Security Investigations agent, this summary witness for the prosecution, who literally condensed a vast amount of digital evidence into these summary charts. And first talk to me about what the defense had to say about messages of Jane, alleged victim 2 in this case. Remember, prosecutors say that Combs used force, fraud, or coercion to induce Jane into engaging in sex acts with male performers, that these happened in all different locations. There was a lot made about her messages, and I guess the idea is she actually a victim of sex trafficking?
Yeah, there were a lot of text messages that were read out loud to the jury once again. And I was kind of wondering, Tinny Garrigo said that the rest of her cross-examination would be maybe an hour to an hour and a half. No, it was a few hours as far as just finishing off the cross-examination for Special Agent Joseph Sorcilio. And so as far as just the messages that go between Jane and Sean Combs, Jane and Escort, again, it was just a lot of messages. But as far as the ones between Jane and Sean Combs, aka PD, aka Diddy, all of that stuff, the defense was talking about how these alleged instances, that being the text messages that were read aloud in court, were actually coming after instances of alleged sex trafficking, according to the government's chart, because the way the government had their chart all mapped out was that there were these particular dates, flights that were associated with it, the financial records also associated with it. But the defense was kind of like, well, she's saying that she had a good night or she had a good time, those types of things. So, for example, there was one text message that was read out loud. It was around Christmas Eve. Didn't quite catch what year it was, but Sean Combs is saying to Jane that SHIT was so effing sexy, and Jane responds, "It keeps getting better. There was so much sexual tension. Did you love it, baby?" And Sean Combs responds, "I loved it." And then Jane is responding, "Sheesh," and she puts a whole bunch of emojis in these text messages. There are other text messages from April 4th of 2022 between Jane and Sean Combs, where Jane is saying, "So what do you want to do? I'm horny AF." And Sean Combs responds, "I've been having fantasies about you and Leo." And Jane says, "I haven't had you all to myself in 5 months. Sean Combs responds, "See if the Italian is free tonight." And then Jane responds, see you around 6:37, want to get dinner. Sean Combs responds, okay, where do you want to eat at? And again, I'm always kind of paraphrasing when reading these messages because there are a lot of texts that are shown to the jury. But even a couple days later, on April 7th of 2022, Sean Combs is writing to Jane, checking on you. Adderall is the greatest. And Jane responds, still thinking about you, sends a whole bunch of drooling and kissy emoji faces, all of that stuff in these messages. So I think it's another point of the defense kind of pointing out that Jane was completely fine doing these hotel nights, to the point where she was even saying these lovey-dovey things, not only to Sean Combs, but also to escorts too. But as far as her text messages go with just Sean Combs, there were other texts that were read out loud where Jane says, I feel mangled too, I'm beat. And Sean Combs is saying maybe something was off with that batch, I think kind of alluding to drugs in these particular texts. Then there were text messages from August of 2022 where Jane is saying, my place is free tonight. Sean Combs is saying, call me. And then Jane responds in kind of a sexually explicit way. And she said, I had so much fun, love you, I'll never take you for granted. My love is unconditional and for life. And then Sean Combs responds with bitmojis or emojis. He kind of responded with some type of character, because when you think about it, Jesse, I'm just writing all these down by the way Tenny Garagos is reading these messages out loud, as opposed to seeing these on the exhibit screen, mainly because this has to do with Jane, and obviously with sensitive information possibly being in these text messages that might have possibly not been redacted. I'm just taking all this information as it's being read. So there was a lot more context into these messages outside of just, I love you too, I'm mangled, I'm beat, all of that stuff. And so even more messages from January of 2023 where Jane is writing to Sean Combs, love you, baby, hope you have a good night, I'm so in love with you. And again, all of these messages are kind of coming either before or after these instances that the government is alleging were acts of sex trafficking. That's what the government was kind of trying to prove with that entire flight summary chart. And then the defense is kind of like, well, in between these dates of when these alleged sexual or sex trafficking had occurred, she's writing these messages of love to Sean Combs, who is allegedly, her sex trafficker. And so these were just some of the messages that were read out loud in court. Another one from May 15th of 2023 where Jane says, I'm just here, baby, showering now. Sean Combs responds, me and Paul are working out, then we can come over. Jane says, you can come here, it's fine, I just wanted to see you. And other messages even from Jane to Sean Combs a couple days later where she's saying, I love you so much, baby, good luck on your interview. And again, the defense claiming this is after she was allegedly trafficked. That's the argument that the government is kind of making. And so again, these were just some of the messages that were read out loud. Others include Sean Combs saying, P's not free tonight, P in reference to Paul. Jane is saying, really, I thought he was there with you, I can reach out to the Italian. Sean Combs says, no need, I just want to see you. Jane says, okay, baby, I just wanted to see you regardless. Sean Combs says, okay, party back on. And Jane says, do you want me to surprise you? Got Italian at 2 a.m. And then Sean Combs responds, did you get Chef? And Chef, I think, is actually kind of a nickname that they gave for Cabral, one of the entertainers that they used. And then Jane says, I was trying for my chefy poo. And so these are, again, were just some of the messages that were read out loud, just as the defense kind of points out that these were lovey-dovey text messages that were sent, as far as showing that Jane may have been willfully participating in these hotel nights, that these weren't against her will, she wasn't sex trafficked by coercion or fraud or anything that the government is alleging, because of these text messages that the defense really wanted to make sure that they showed the jury before the jury eventually gets the closing arguments, which are happening later this week.
And that she had a sense of agency and choice, because if Combs writes her, if she says to him, baby, I want to make love to you, I haven't selfishly had you to myself for 5 months, and she goes, I'm fine with the other stuff, but I really just need you right now, and he replies, okay, whatever you want, that doesn't fit neatly into the concept of him being a sex trafficker and using illegal means to force her into commercial sex acts. And, the defense making the point, these charts, sure, they're useful for the prosecution, but they're not complete. They don't provide the full context of the relationship and the situation. Now, I also understand there were messages from Jane with this male performer, and I think these are significant too. Talk to us about these messages between Jane, and I think the name is Sly or Cabral, I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, Cabral is a name that these jurors have heard over and over again when it comes to Jane, mainly because Cabral was an entertainer that Sean Combs and Jane had used in their hotel nights or nights of debauchery, Wild King nights, whatever we're calling them. So there were a lot of messages that were shown that the defense was kind of pointing out that Jane had these communications with these entertainers too. So for example, the flight summary chart before they had turned the gallery screens completely off, we saw that there was one of the rows for this particular chart was from December 17th of 2021 through December 21st of 2021. It was at the one hotel in Miami, Florida, and the people that were kind of associated with that particular booking were Jane, Sean Combs, Cabral, and another entertainer named Dawn. And so the jury was able to see some of the financial transactions for this particular hotel night. That included $800 cash app for Dawn, $550 cash app for Dawn. But then the text messages were associated with Cabral. So again, that being in that same time frame of mid-December of 2021, where Jane is messaging Cabral, elaborate on intense. And this was after Cabral had sent some messages saying that they had a very intense night. Cabral responds, "You were talking so dirty to me." Jane responds, "Send me something," as far as like a picture goes. And then Cabral said, "Most definitely, it gets better and better." And then Jane says, "Damn, baby, you got me so hot. Want to come back tomorrow?" Cabral responds, "Baby, I would love to, but I'm busy with Christmas stuff." And then Jane sends some emojis with some eyes, and then she says, "Please." And, a lot of these messages included emojis, which included these next messages from January 1st of 2022 to just a couple weeks later, where Jane is messaging Cabral, "Are you free to travel today?" She sends 4 heart emojis. "Here's your flight information." And then she says later along the lines in these messages, "Excited to see you." Cabral responds, "Excited to see you as well." Jane says the next day, "Hey babe, how far are you?" Cabral says, "I'll be there soon." Jane says, "Can't wait to see you." And then Cabral responds, "On the way, baby," and sends some heart emojis too. And these, again, just some of the instances of text messages where I think the defense was really trying to point out that Jane had these relationships, or at least was in friendly communication with these entertainers too. Whereas Jane, when she was testifying, especially testifying on behalf of the government, she was saying that anytime she was messaging these entertainers, it was because Sean Combs was near and around her, kind of forcing her to message these entertainers. But I think the defense using these messages show that she did this even outside of being around Sean Combs. So then there were messages from November 5th of 2022. So people have been following this case pretty closely. They know it's around the time of Sean Combs' birthday, that being, I think, November 4th. And so Jane messages Paul, another entertainer that they use, where Jane says, "Hey, are you free? It's for his birthday." Paul responds that he was out of town, but then he ended up traveling back. And then Jane says, "Hey, P, have you landed? Do you need the Addy?" Addy as in address, not Adderall or anything like that. And then Paul responds, "Just landed." And then Jane says, come over to wherever she is. And then Paul responds, 5 minutes away. And so there were even just messages in terms of Jane kind of planning these hotel nights, in terms of her reaching out to these entertainers and in order to kind of help book their travel and get things going so that way they could attend these hotel nights. Where there was another example, these are text messages between Jane and Paul around March of 2023 when they were going on that Turks and Caicos trip that Jane had testified about when she was testifying in this trial, where Jane texted Paul, "Hey love, are you available? I wanted to put something together for Sean." She later says, "You're unavailable and it was because of these certain days," just kind of clarifying what days he was available in order to come out to Turks and Caicos with them. And then Paul responds yes in terms of the dates that he was available. And then Jane responds, and this is another text message from the month after, so when they came back from their Turks and Caicos trips, where Jane says to Paul, "Hey Paul, good morning. Sean texted me Thursday. What time do you leave? Also, are you available on Wednesday?" And so I think, again, the defense really kind of pointing out that she was one to be reaching out to these entertainers or escorts. Again, these are just some of them, because there was one message in particular, Jesse, where Jane messaged to Cabral, and this is where I say, like, he's also kind of nicknamed the chef, because she told him, "How much would it cost for you to miss out on these chef gigs?" And I think the defense pointing out here that they wanted to bring Cabral over for kind of a hotel night, and she was even willing to pay him, possibly through Sean Combs, possibly through whoever, in order to get Cabral to miss one of his professional work gigs, that being a gig that he had for cooking pretty much, in order to come to attend to these hotel nights too.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things to take away from that. Obviously, it's not great evidence for the prosecution. It makes their case a lot more gray, not black and white, but gray. Having said that, it's interesting when we're following this, and I'm looking at the comments on social media, there are a lot of people who say this doesn't negate the fact that this could have been non-consensual, that as this has been explored already in the prosecution's case, the abuser-victim relationship can be a lot more complicated. And when we talk about consent, is something really consensual if somebody has financial control over you, or there is pressure, or there's a power imbalance? Those are all considerations the jury has to make, whether it's Cassie or Jane. Having said it, these messages really complicate it for the prosecution, and this is not a clean-cut case of a sex trafficker and victim as we've seen in other prosecutions. Was the jury shown more videos today, sexually explicit videos?
They definitely were. Now, initially, Tinny Garagos was going to show these videos bright and early this morning, literally at the start of the trial day, and there were some technical difficulties. They had some issues with the headphones. They had to charge them, all of that stuff. So they didn't see them bright and early, which I think might have been a good thing. But then at the same time, they showed them right before lunch. So it's like, honestly, I kind of felt bad for them. It was either show them right at the beginning of the day or show them right before they go to lunch. But they did show those sexually explicit videos once again. And these particular ones, from my understanding, were the ones featuring Sean Combs, Jane, and whoever entertainer that they were using. And so there were moments that they were showing these videos, not as long as they were doing, I think, the other days, but long enough for, I think, the jury to kind of get the point of where these videos are and what these videos were about. But they were able to see them. And from what I could tell, Jesse, just their reaction, I don't know if they're kind of maybe tired of seeing these sexually explicit videos and are kind of like, why are they showing so many of them? Because even though we think of them as like 30 seconds here, a minute there, it's still a long amount of time to be seeing these types of videos. But from what I could tell and from what I could see of the jury, they seemed, don't want to say the word engaged, but they seemed like they were just, watching the exhibits, watching the sexually explicit video. From what I could tell from where I was sitting inside the courtroom, not having any type of, again, visible reaction from what I could see. But I did peek at one juror who I feel like, again, he was that same one kind of sitting towards the end where, like, I feel like he couldn't take his headphones off fast enough, because I can only imagine how uncomfortable it is for the jury to be watching these types of videos in open court, as a lot of people are staring at them to see their reaction. Because, for everyone who doesn't know, again, these aren't stuff that we in the public or in the media and that part of the gallery are seeing. It's really only the jury, the parties, the witness, and the judge who are watching these videos. And so everybody's eyes are pretty much either on Sean Combs or the jury, trying to get some type of reaction from either of them. And for the most part, as far as the jury is concerned, I didn't see much of a reaction from them outside of probably just wanting the videos to be over and done with.
It seems to me the defense may be showing these videos, and again, I don't know what the videos actually show, but if you are seeing an enthusiastic Jane, if these videos don't show any outward signs of reluctance or pressure or coercion or duress, you could see why the defense is showing them. Prosecution, I think they had to show them a lot to say, hey, we've established the payments, we've established the travel, you've heard testimony about these events happening. This is proof. We got video proof these hotel nights or these freak-offs actually happen. One of the things we have to establish is these events actually happen. And maybe there are instances in these videos where Sean Combs is directing the sex workers, or the male performers, or the alleged victims into doing things, and it goes into the coercion aspect of it. But again, we don't know. We haven't seen the videos. Now, I will tell you, and I think this is key. This is something that was brought up later by the defense. Wasn't there evidence during the cross-examination of this Homeland Security investigations agent to suggest that Sean Combs was making an effort to actively not involve his staff, his inner circle, in all of these sexual episodes, which, if that's the case, would really hurt the racketeering charge, right? Because the prosecution wants to say there was a criminal enterprise. He used his staff, he used his inner circle to facilitate freak-offs and wild king nights and hotel nights. They were an integral part of it. They were setting it all up. They knew these were criminal activities. They were covering it all up, whatever it is. But wasn't there evidence and messages to suggest he didn't want them involved? And this was more, I guess, personal than him using his businesses or him using his resources or him using his staff to set it all up and do all of it?
Honestly, Jesse, throughout this trial, it's been kind of mixed messaging on how much the staff really knew about what was going on in these hotel nights or Wild King nights. But it seems like from the defense's perspective that there was kind of this effort to conceal it from his staff, from his assistants, so that way they wouldn't know. So in terms of Jane messaging Paul to come over after the butlers are gone, again, so that way they could kind of conceal that he was over and they were about to engage in, sex acts or a hotel night, those types of things. Or even Sean Combs messaging Paul, hold up, the staff is outside, they leave now, hang tight. Sean Combs also messaging Jane, I can't have KK know, damn. And Combs also messaging Jane saying, hit me when the coast is clear. Jane also sending messages to Joey is gone and the Italian is pulling up, And then even Sean Combs back to Jane saying maybe 9:30 so he doesn't run into anyone. So again, just kind of alluding to the fact that there was kind of this effort between Sean Combs and Jane to really kind of conceal these entertainers, especially when they were over at Sean Combs's home, which is interesting because at some points they were saying, okay, well, he didn't want the staff to know that these hotel nights were happening at Sean Combs' home, especially after the Cassie lawsuit, which is possibly why that they moved these over to Jane's residence, where they don't have all these assistants and butlers and house managers and all this staff coming over and kind of knowing all that this is about. But I do think it kind of does poke holes in the government's case where they're claiming that it's this giant big conspiracy that all the staff knew, all the staff was helping conceal up what was going on in these hotel nights or Wild King nights. But it seems like from what the defense was pointing out with these particular messages, that it seems that there was, again, this big effort to really kind of conceal what was happening. As the defense claims that this was just something that he did privately. He didn't want his staff to know about this, as opposed to what the government is alleging, where they believe that this has been just a giant conspiracy in order to keep Sean Combs up at the top of his alleged criminal enterprise, I should say.
By the way, like when there's messages where he didn't want Christina Coram to know what was going on, his former chief of staff, do we know why he didn't want her to know? I mean, the message, I can't have KK know, damn, why?
Yeah, that wasn't necessarily clear as to why, but I do remember even after the Cassie lawsuit had dropped that the defense really kind of pointed out these particular messages where Christina Coram is saying things along the lines of, you shouldn't have lied to me, you should have told me everything. And I'm wondering, does it have to do with maybe her not being fully in the know of what was going on in these Wild King night or hotel nights? Because if I was a juror on this case, that would kind of linger through my mind. How much did Christina Coram, who hasn't testified on behalf of the government, who hasn't testified on behalf of the defense, like what did she truly know, as the government claims she was a co-conspirator? But it seems like what the defense is pointing out with these messages is that it seemed like at some points in this, according to the defense's argument, that maybe Christina Coram really didn't know all that was entailed in these hotel nights, really that their job was just kind of to set it up in terms of just bringing the guests over, or candles and lights, nothing that was happening, anything close to alleged sex trafficking behind these closed doors at these hotel nights, or in cases of them being at Jane's residence or Sean Combs' residence. It didn't seem like from these messages that maybe she didn't know the full scope of what was really going on.
And I know that the prosecution had an opportunity to redirect this witness. And it seemed to me they were basically like, what? Yeah, these charts don't include every text message in this case. And I think at one point, didn't they even try to say, hey, this is a clear evidence of transportation to engage in prostitution, right? Don't we have evidence that Sean Combs transported this sex worker or sex workers for purposes of prostitution? And I think there was an objection. I think they were really trying to hit the point. I've always said, I think those two charges where it's literally transporting sex workers and alleged victims across state lines for the purposes of prostitution, it feels like more of a slam dunk kind of case. Isn't that what they tried to hit home when they redirected him?
Yeah, they try to bring it back a little bit, but of course there were going to be a bunch of objections from the defense, because right off the gate, AUSA Maureen Comey was like, okay, did those financial records show that Sean Combs paid for transporting people across state lines? The defense, that being Tenny Garrigo, stood up and was, or I think she might have been sitting down in this particular instance, but she was just kind of like, objection, Your Honor. Again, the government really kind of trying to point like that he was paying for people to be transported across state lines. They were really trying to get that question in as they started their redirect, but then there was a bunch of objections by the defense. And so those objections were sustained by the judge. And so then Maureen Comey was just like, okay, well, did they show that they being the records. Did the record show that Sean Combs paid for travel? The witness replies, yes. Did you recall texts? Are they every single text or what you were just shown? And then the witness replied, what I was just shown. And this was something that they even talked about during his direct examination, where he was only given the exhibits that the government gave him. It wasn't like he was doing a really big investigation on this, that he did this independently. It was really just all the exhibits, the messages, the videos, everything that goes with it that was handed to him by the government. And so the government then pulls up messages from around the time frame of Cassie's lawsuit. Then there was a sidebar. And then I was thinking at that point, the jury looks tired. They were just going through so many messages by this point. But then the government kind of ended by saying, they brought up the June 18th/19th, 2024 incident where Jane was allegedly physically assaulted by Sean Combs at her home, that the government says, okay, well, were the texts after this incident happened, were they loving in nature? And then the witness was like, they weren't loving in nature. And then that's where they kind of ended with their last witness, because soon afterwards, the government rested their case.
And let's talk about that. So the government rested their case. And then, as expected, the defense moved for a Rule 29 motion for judgment of acquittal. Again, basically, the idea is there is nothing for the jury to decide, Judge. There is insufficient evidence to sustain a conviction. And it's interesting, the arguments, because it kind of gives us a preview of what the defense's closing arguments would be. And honestly, I don't mean to toot my own horn, or our horn, I should say. It is stuff, it is arguments we have anticipated, we have been bringing up, we have been making for the past 7 weeks. So let's take it piece by piece. What were the arguments from the defense regarding racketeering conspiracy? Why do they say there is insufficient evidence to sustain a conviction on racketeering conspiracy?
Well, like I tell you guys, every single time when there are arguments that happen outside of the presence of the jury, that's when you can really see everybody in action in kind of their true form. They're not playing it up for the jury, none of that. But it's interesting because this motion was done by Alexandra Shapiro, somebody that the jury hasn't seen in action in terms of cross-examining a witness, none of that sort. So, I like seeing Alexandra Shapiro kind of in action whenever she's making arguments on behalf of the defense. But she did have a lot of arguments to really kind of go for this motion, that being the judgment for acquittal. And so right off the gate, they really got into the RICO part where the defense is like, okay, well, the government hasn't proved their case from count 1 to count 5. Under count 1, Mr. Combs is entitled to judgment of acquittal because the government must prove that Combs worked with others in pattern of racketeering. She alleges that the government hasn't proved it, that the agreement was to violate RICO, but instead the government alleges that there were 8 patterns of racketeering and the proof is deficient. She says the enterprise must be more than a group of people. And she said the relationships need to tie the enterprise together. She said that these crimes are really in relation to his girlfriends and his private time that happened at, hotel rooms. And she says there's insufficient proof of the RICO indictment. The evidence doesn't show Mr. Combs conspired with anyone. She says that the only thing that the employees did was help with travel arrangements for the girlfriends or procuring maybe a small amount of personal use drugs. And so she had said that the only thing the employees knew was that he liked baby oil, Astroglide, and he liked alcohol. And so the defense brought up, Brendan Paul's testimony, Jonathan Perez's testimony, David James's testimony. These were all assistants that testified as government witnesses. And she said that all 3 of them had kind of mentioned that they thought these hotel nights were personal in nature. And so in terms of even just the escorts or entertainers that were booked, they were booked by a combination of Cassie, Jane, and even Sean Combs, something that they did admit to. But they say that there was no employees that were helping with the booking. And so then the defense mentioned that Diddy was not even wanting Christina Quorum to know that Paul was even coming over to his home, something that was talked about in those text messages too. And she said that there was numerous evidence showing that the employees helped Cassie more so than Sean Combs in terms of just, if they're building up this enterprise in order to benefit Sean Combs specifically. The defense points out there was plenty of instances where they helped out Cassie specifically instead of Sean Combs, such as D-Rock and his wife April and even Christina Quorum, and how they protected her from Sean Combs's anger. The defense also pointed out that the employees didn't know that sex crimes were going on, that Christina Quorum, even though she's been a name that's been mentioned throughout this duration of this trial pretty much, that Christina Quorum, that there was no evidence that she believed his girlfriends were being coerced, and that if he did want drugs, again, it was only for a small personal use. It wasn't with the intent to distribute or sell, nothing like that. And then the defense was like, well, there's evidence that he was lying to her. And they kind of point back to that message from Christina Quorum to Sean Combs again after Cassie's lawsuit, where she had mentioned If you're lying to me, this isn't going to work. That's how we got to where we are now. And so the defense is like, Christina Quorum, she didn't appear in the evidence till March of 2016, but the conspiring, according to the government's indictment, goes all the way back years prior to Christina Quorum even kind of showing up in the evidence. And the defense is like, it doesn't work that way, where you can just kind of put a co-conspirator in the middle of this alleged enterprise and the dates that these enterprise was running and just be like, here, jury, this is a criminal, that type of thing. And so then Alexandra Shapiro kind of broke down the RICO because, RICO is not just RICO. It's all these different predicate acts that, even I myself am just having to remember that there is a few in there. And so it's something that the jury will have to consider, such as bribery, where the defense kind of pointed out, the trial showed that there was no evidence of Combs committing bribery in terms of preventing a witness from going to law enforcement or going to police, because they brought up the March 2016 incident at the Intercontinental Hotel, that they were pretty much alleging that Sean Combs paying Eddie Garcia that $100,000 for the tape of the surveillance video from that incident wasn't because they were preventing Eddie Garcia from going to the police or Officer Israel Flores, who had testified as one of the first witnesses, that these discussions weren't about them not going to the police. These discussions were more so about preventing this tape from getting out, because Cassie didn't want police to be called, but Cassie didn't want the bad press that might have been associated with this tape getting out, but neither did Sean Combs. And so they're alleging that that doesn't kind of fall under bribery, especially under RICO. And so then they kind of get into the obstruction and witness tampering in terms of Jane and Mia, where the messages that Mia had testified to after Cassie's lawsuit was filed, and about D-Rock messaging her shortly afterwards, where Mia was kind of like, I think that D-Rock was trying to set something up for me in terms of money, because he was trying to get me on the phone with Sean Combs, or Puff as she calls him. Mia was actually, this is according to the defense, that Mia was actually excited to talk to D-Rock, and the defense kind of points back to her testimony for that particular part. Then the defense claimed that Sean Combs was just trying to get in touch with her just because. It wasn't that there was a reason in terms of obstruction or witness tampering, because the defense pointed out that Mia sent a particular message to D-Rock talking about how she was out of money or Skrilla or something like that. And so the defense was like, well, the government characterized these messages as nice, and that Alexandra Shapiro was like, there is no evidence Mr. Combs was aware of a federal investigation happening around this time frame in terms of when he was reaching out to Mia, that being in late 2023 up until I think February of 2024, when they just stopped communication altogether and he stopped trying to reach out with her. But even in terms of the obstruction and witness tampering in relation to Jane, according to the defense, they were talking about that recorded conversation after Cassie's lawsuit was filed too. And Alexandra Shapiro said Mr. Combs made statements like, what do I need to do to make you feel better? How can I be there for you? And then Jane had testified that Sean Combs acted this way all the time. And so the defense was like, okay, well, Jane thought that this call was about her rent, but he was already paying for her rent around this time frame. So there's no suggestion that Jane was even going to go to law enforcement around this time. And even in terms of just forced labor, Jesse, they were kind of saying, this case is different from other forced labor cases. And I think they kind of had a little bit of a strong argument here, where they say the statute normally talks about immigrant workers, their living situation, etc., whereas it's kind of different cases here, whereas Capricorn Clark, Mia, Jane, and Cassie, according to the defense, it all suggested that they were all victims of forced labor. And the defense says that these are able-bodied United States citizens, and they say despite the abusive behavior, they continued to stay, and that they didn't leave because of this abusive behavior. They left for other reasons, because they said Capricorn Clark brought up the lie detector incidents, but she still kept on working for Sean Combs. And even in terms of her talking about overtime pay and whether or not that falls under forced labor, the defense says not being paid overtime doesn't equal forced labor. So then the defense claims that Capricorn Clark actually left her job after being pushed by Sean Combs, and that is the reason that she left, not because of forced labor or anything like that. And that Capricorn Clark still wanted to work for Sean Combs, because the defense brought up her wrongful termination, but that Capricorn Clark still wanted to work for Sean Combs. And then even in terms of forced labor in relation to Mia, they say that those elements weren't met. And then they were kind of talking about forced labor in terms of Jane and Cassie, but they also argued, if the evidence is sufficient to sex trafficking, they also don't apply to forced labor. But I think the big ones, for me at least, were kidnapping and arson. I kind of wanted to hear what the defense had to say about those two predicate acts, where in terms of kidnapping, they were talking about the Capricorn Clark incident, about her being kind of held, according according to her, against her will, take all these lie detector tests whenever she was accused of stealing jewelry. But the defense says that there was no evidence that Mr. Combs even knew about this, that he only knew that the jewelry was missing and that her communications, her being Capricorn Clark, were really with Paul Alford, aka Uncle Polly, one of the security guards, and the administrator of the lie detector test. The defense pointed out Capricorn Clark testified that she voluntarily continued to take these lie detector tests, and she took them for about 5 days back to back to back, and that she, again, did this voluntarily. She didn't do this, and she wasn't being held against her will, none of that stuff. And so even in terms of Cassie being allegedly held in the London hotel after an incident of physical violence, the defense says that there's no evidence that force was used in order to take her to this hotel, that she could have left this hotel at any time, so it doesn't fall under kidnapping, none of that. And of course, the big thing being arson in relation to Scott Mescudi, aka Kid Cudi, and the Molotov cocktail that was lodged into his car. The defense says that there's no evidence that Mr. Combs participated in this event in terms of the Molotov cocktail because, again, the defense pointing out there was female DNA found on that Molotov cocktail, not male DNA either.
And here's what's interesting about this. The judge could look back and say, I'm not dismissing the racketeering charge, but I'll tell you what, some of those underlying predicate crimes, I might strike those. Remember what's happening here. So, and I think that you hit a number of different angles. Defense is saying, first of all, there's no criminal enterprise. There's no criminal agreement. There's no common purpose, like you said, with respect to what the assistants knew or didn't know. And the prosecution also needs to prove at least 2 underlying predicate crimes. So they want to have forced labor. They want to have arson, kidnapping, sex trafficking, bribery, drug offenses. But the judge might say, you know what, with respect to some of them, I agree. I don't think there's enough evidence there to establish it. I'm going to strike those. So it gives the jury less options to find him guilty of racketeering. It gives the prosecution less options to argue when it comes to a closing argument. And by the way, it goes back to a question we got earlier today during the lunch show. Somebody had said, how come the jury just doesn't get the jury instructions at the beginning of the case as opposed to the end of the case? Well, let's see what's presented. Let's see what's actually shown during the course of the trial. There might be insufficient evidence to actually move forward with some of these charges or some of these elements. So it's interesting. Now, what about sex trafficking? What were the arguments that the defense made for why the sex trafficking should be thrown out? And by the way, let me just say this. For the prosecution's point of view, they are arguing that Jane and Cassie were victims of sex trafficking, that Combs used force, fraud, or coercion to induce them to engage in sex acts with male commercial sex workers. Something of value was exchanged. There is a transportation element to it as well. What did they say? What did they argue for why this should be thrown out?
Well, everyone has to remember that Sean Combs is charged with 2 counts of sex trafficking, count 2 and then count 4. Count 2 kind of involving alleged victim number 1, that being Cassie Ventura, and then count 4 involving alleged victim number 2, that being Jane Doe. So in terms of their arguments for count 2 specifically, Alexandra Shapiro said, you know, the key element here is what Sean Combs knew, and that they allege that Cassie didn't really communicate her reluctance to doing these freak-offs or hotel nights, as they were later called, that under count 2, the defense says that the relationship was toxic for many reasons, something that they've been kind of talking to all the way dating back to the pretrial stuff. And the defense also kind of pointing out, you know, they acknowledge that Sean Combs was, according to Alexandra Shapiro, she used the words regrettably violent. And so it's something that the defense acknowledged throughout the course of this trial, going all the way back to openings where they, you know, they say that Sean Combs, and they admit he was violent with his girlfriends, and in this case, Cassie. And the defense says domestic violence is not evidence of sex trafficking, something that I think a lot of people who have been following this case on social media, some people think this way. But in terms of count 4, in relation to alleged victim number 2, that being Jane, the defense says that the evidence is insufficient and that Mr. Combs couldn't have known that Jane didn't want to participate in these hotel nights. Alexandra Shapiro said the evidence showed that Jane was willing to participate. Again, going back to just some of those text messages that the jury was able to see. And I kind of agree with you there, Jesse, where it did kind of feel like this is maybe maybe a little preview, a little sneak peek of what their closing arguments are going to be, maybe just on a smaller scale as opposed to what we'll really see in court on Thursday and possibly Friday. But according to Alexandra Shapiro, they say that the evidence showed that Jane, again, was willing to participate, and she had financial gains to participate too, including the house that Sean Combs had paid for her. Again, something that he's still paying for even to this day, even though he's incarcerated at MDC Brooklyn, pending the outcome of this trial. And then the defense says that the government shouldn't be able to argue the fraud theory because the government alleges this was sex trafficking by fraud as opposed to maybe Cassie, where it might have been by coercion, or maybe just all three of them. But the government specifically with Jane had said that this is sex trafficking by fraud with the promises of that they would spend the time together, just the two of them, whereas an entertainer kind of always ended up joining them whenever Jane and Sean Combs were together. And so the defense says that Jane's subjective beliefs are all that the government is kind of relying on, that being that Diddy should have been able to interpret the messages that she had sent, that he should have been able to interpret the reluctance and that type of thing, something that she had even testified to, that he should have known what she meant by saying so and so and so. But then they kind of talk about the fight on June 18th, 19 of 2024, and they say that fight was kind of not sufficient because she didn't have to let the escort into her house even after the physical altercation, where they were kind of differentiating it from Cassie and the March 2016 incident, where they were kind of saying, Cassie was leaving a freak off. She didn't invite an escort or somebody over afterwards. Whereas Jane, she didn't have to let this escort into her home after this physical assault had occurred. They were alleging that at any point, and this was something that they even talked about during her cross-examination, that at any point she could have left, or that she could have drove away. She could have not even let the escort into her home, but instead she did let the escort into her home. They did engage in a hotel night even after this June 18th, 19th of 2024 physical assault that occurred.
So, right, consensual, he didn't have the mens rea, the criminal intent. By the way, even if the judge doesn't agree that there is enough here to actually throw the charges out, you are 100% right. These are the same arguments they can make in a closing argument, and the jury might be persuaded and say, I don't see sex trafficking. I side with the defense here. I don't think prosecution hasn't proved it beyond a reasonable doubt. Finally, we got transportation to engage in prostitution. I've said it before. I will say it again. Feels to me, based on the travel receipts, the payment records, the testimony, the text messages, saying Sean Combs transported sex workers and these women for the purposes of sex work. You don't need force, fraud, or coercion, as far as I understand. Feels like the most straightforward case. What did they argue saying these charges should be thrown out? And there's one with respect to Cassie, and there's one with respect to Jane.
Exactly. And just kind of similar to how count 2 and 4, it's count 3 and 5, one for Cassie, one for Jane. And so in terms of just their arguments about count 3 and count 5, the defense says that there's no sufficient evidence that the escorts got paid for prostitution, which I kind of thought was an interesting argument, given that you're calling them escorts, but then saying that they weren't paid for the point of prostitution. And then they kind of brought it back to Sheree Hayes, who we know now to be the Punisher, and then Daniel Phillips, somebody that was also used during the freak-offs in relation to Cassie, how they both testified as government witnesses in this case, and that they both testified that they weren't prostitutes, that they were just paid for time and experience. They weren't paid under the guise that this was prostitution or that they were actually prostitutes. But I think it's interesting that she called them escorts, but then said that they weren't paid for prostitution. So, you can kind of see why maybe they did that. But at the same time, it was an interesting argument. But we'll see what the judge ultimately has to say in terms of whether or not he'll dismiss any of this, but we'll see what happens.
Well, did the government have a response? Because from what I saw in the reporting, there wasn't much there that they responded to, or they're waiting to respond. So talk to us what the government's response was, or lack thereof, and has the judge decided, as far as you know, this motion for judgment of acquittal?
Yeah, so the government's response wasn't much of a response at all. I was expecting, given the length of those arguments by the defense, that maybe the government might take equal or maybe more amount of time to kind of get those final arguments in their case. But really, they were kind of like, this case should still be given to the jury. They planned on, I think, possibly submitting a letter just kind of to point out the defense's arguments here and there. But in terms of just the judge, he said he's going to reserve his decision, meaning that we didn't hear what his final decision was going to be. But given that they are still talking about charge conference, they're still talking about closing arguments happening on Thursday and Friday, it seems that, for the most part, we're still geared up. It doesn't seem like that judgment of acquittal in full might be, fully taken by the judge, but we'll see. He's still kind of reserving his opinion. So you never know what can happen in this case. But for now, we're just kind of waiting to see what he has to say tomorrow.
And let's talk about Sean Combs. So Sean Combs in open court spoke, and this was about his decision, and it's his decision alone, whether or not he wants to testify. What happened?
So this is a moment that the jury isn't able to see. Again, the jury's not here when this is happening, but we inside the gallery, the public, the press, we're all able to kind of finally see Sean Combs speak a little bit, because we don't see him speak beyond just him chatting with his attorneys. We don't hear him on an open mic. Beyond, I think, the little utterance he had at the beginning of jury selection where he said, "I'm nervous, Your Honor," but now we got to hear him once again on a mic kind of talk about reasons why he's not going to testify. But he didn't get that much into it. Now, in terms of just the way he sounded, I will say this, Jesse, he sounded a little raspy when he was on the mic today in terms of him standing up to kind of allocute on his right to testify. But I think what was interesting, too, is that it felt like at times he might have been kind of like buttering up the judge a little bit, where he said, the judge asked him, "How are you doing today?" And then Sean Combs says, "I'm great. How are you?" And then he even told the judge, "You're doing a great job, Your Honor." And so I think, the Sean Combs giving the judge his credit, credit is due.
Didn't he actually say you're doing an excellent job? Not just great. He said you're doing an excellent job.
So I heard you're doing a great job. And then I think he had said another kind of verb or adjective afterwards, and it might have been excellent. But I think I was just writing down so fast. I didn't hear that last part. But I think another reporter said the same thing, that he said great and excellent. So he really was kind of giving the judge those compliments there, when really the question at hand was, are you going to be testifying or not? But, Sean Combs did what every single defendant does. He confers with his attorneys. He has lots of discussions with his attorneys. We hope that a lot of defendants are having a lot of discussions with their attorneys about whether or not to testify. But in this case, despite what Mark Agnifilo was initially kind of telling the press in terms of the beginning of the trial, where he said, "I don't know if I could keep Sean Combs off of the stand," it's official now. Sean Combs will not take the stand to testify in his own defense, which is something that, I thought there might have been like a very 2% possibility it would happen, but still 2% is some possibility, but then that didn't end up happening. And so the defense, they went about their case, which was very, very short too.
Yeah. Look, it says something about where the defense feels. They feel they might have raised enough reasonable doubt through cross-examination, through some of the messages alone that were presented during the course of this case that seemed problematic for the witnesses. There's no need for him to testify. There's a lot more risk for him to testify. And so then it becomes the defense's case, and they didn't call any witnesses, right? They just presented exhibits. And I want to take this a little piece by piece. What were the exhibits they presented regarding Cassie? Let's start there.
Yeah, and I will say this, Jesse, I was very disappointed that the defense didn't call any witness. I thought they would have at least one person who would be called to the stand, whether it be Vasha, whether it be Dr. Bardet. I thought they would have at least one witness just in their, their belt hole, whatever it's called, but that didn't happen. So what did the jury see? More text messages, probably something that they didn't want to see, especially at this point in the trial. But in terms of just Cassie and the defense's case, they were bringing about those text messages once again. So they brought the flight summary chart done by the government, and then they were pointing out text messages that were associated around the 2012 timeframe, where Sean Combs writes to Cassie, "We're going to have so much fun tonight." And Cassie responds, "I know." And then the defense claims that this text message was before an alleged instance of sex trafficking. And then later, Cassie sends a message to Dave. That was an escort or entertainer that they used during their freak-offs, where Cassie said to him, "Hey, are you working today?" Then they go into the flight chart once again, this being from December 20th of 2012. And then you see a corresponding text message from that same date where Cassie says, "LOL, I took the piece of Adderall before I left. The last round was pretty hot for me. I need to treat my pop better. You give me so much love. I love being in love with you. I know I'll never have a love like this. I know I haven't been the easiest, but I'm trying." Then there were more messages where Sean Combs writes to Cassie, "You think you can FO without getting high?" And Cassie responds, "Yeah, LOL." Then they kind of bring it a little more current in terms of just the time frame kind of getting closer to the time that Sean Combs and Cassie were going to break up, because they brought a text from April 5th of 2017, because initially these text messages that they were first showing were from 2012. And I was like, okay, these are a little bit older, but they brought some 2017 messages where Cassie writes to Sean Combs, "Can you send me a D pic? LOL." Then she writes, "I miss you." Sean Combs writes, "So what are you going to do?" And Cassie says, "Be your little freak." And I will say this, Jesse, this "be your little freak" text message that was sent by Cassie on April 5th of 2017 was something that the government did not want the jury to see. They objected to that specific text message, as well as this one from May 14th of 2017, where Cassie wrote to Sean Combs, "LOL, I just bought baby oil because I couldn't help myself." And again, that was another message that the government objected to. They didn't want that message to be put in. Obviously, with the defense reading this, you know that the judge ruled to put this particular message in, something that the government, I don't think, was too happy about. But then the defense also talked about this particular message from May 30th of 2017, where Cassie writes to Sean Combs, "About to pass out. I just wanted to let you know I'm really happy and proud of us. We've been together for a long time. You're my best friend. I love you." And again, always paraphrasing with these messages, because it really was a pretty long message, but it was really lovey-dovey in nature, as far as just the amount of time that they were together, how much Cassie loves him, enjoys being with him, that the two are stronger only because they're together, that type of thing. And so the defense is kind of pointing out, even kind of in the later time of June 9th of 2017 through June 11th of 2017, that was associated with this alleged act of sex trafficking, that in between this, Cassie sent a message to Sean Combs saying, "I love you and I'm in love with you. I want to be happy too." And so the defense really, again, kind of pointing out that these messages were lovey in nature, that these weren't instances that were happening after, this coercive alleged sex trafficking, none of that sort, because Cassie would send these really lovey-dovey messages. And then the defense also kind of pointing out the only reason that Cassie kind of broke up with Sean Combs wasn't because of, sex trafficking or her not wanting to engage in these freak-offs. They allege that it was because of jealousy, as opposed to her being a victim of alleged sex trafficking.
Yeah, and it's not just the content of these messages, but the number of messages that the jury has heard, particularly the number of messages that the defense just presented in their case, strategic on their part, reinforcing this idea of consent, reinforcing this idea that she's not a victim of sex trafficking. The other way of looking at it is, again, you can have somebody who says yes 9 times out of 10, but the time that they say no, that's no consent. That can make them a victim of sexual abuse. That can make them a victim of sex trafficking. And there was evidence presented by the prosecution of force, fraud, or coercion. Whether it's beyond a reasonable doubt, that's up for the jury to decide. But there was evidence to suggest not everything was on the up and up all the time. Now, what about the defense? What did they present when it came to alleged victim Mia, Brianna Bungolan, who Brianna Bungolan says that she was dangled off of a balcony by Sean Combs. Mia says that she had worked for Sean Combs, was sexually assaulted by him. I think Dawn Richard came up as well during the course of the defense's case. What did the defense present regarding these witnesses?
Well, they presented a bunch of stipulations. And honestly, Jesse, if I knew nothing about, trials, criminal proceedings, I would be like, why are you showing me a bunch of documents? Why is no one explaining to me what this stipulation means? But I think I kind of know where the defense was kind of going with this, because they brought a bunch of stipulations, one including in relation to Daniel Phillip. He was one of the escorts that Cassie and Sean Combs used during their freak-offs. And so this particular stipulation said in part, on October 7th of 2024, Daniel Phillip told law enforcement he would get jealous when Sean Combs would have sex with Cassie because he liked her romantically. Then there was one from Dawn Richard, and in terms of just her meetings with law enforcement, kind of pointing out to March 18th of 2025, where in this particular meeting, Dawn Richard had told law enforcement that Sean Combs had threw eggs at Cassie, because remember, under the cross-examination of Dawn Richard by Nicole Westmoreland, there was this whole conversation of whether or not it was a pan thrown, it was eggs thrown, like what type of device was actually thrown. Did it just try to toss it in her direction? Did it actually hit her? There was all these conversations under her cross-examination. But according to the stipulation, the first 4 out of 7 meetings, that Dawn also didn't mention that the whole people go missing thing that was allegedly said to her by Sean Combs, because that was also kind of a big point of her cross-examination. Does this, people go missing statement that was allegedly made by Sean Combs, is it kind of a threat, that being a death threat? Is this the right way to interpret a threat? Those types of things. When it came to Sheree Hayes, who we know as the Punisher, his stipulation was talking about how he had told law enforcement he had feelings for Cassie. And this was something that the defense pointed out under Daniel Phillips' cross-examination, as well as Sheree Hayes, aka the Punisher's cross-examination, on whether or not these men had feelings, romantic feelings at that, for Cassie, or whether that they were just doing this as a part of their job or part of a performance, that type of thing. But even in terms of Capricorn Clark, the stipulation talked about how the first 11 out of 13 meetings, that they don't reflect Capricorn Clark stating that she had called Lauren London outside of Kid Cudi's home in 2011. And even when she was testifying about Lauren London, I think there was a whole conversation on whether or not the person who was jotting the notes down misheard her, that she might have said another name that sounded like Lauren London, as opposed to her actually saying Lauren London. And so then kind of the final two, that being Mia and Vanna. For Mia, the defense brought the stipulation about how the first 3 of 31 meetings with Mia, they don't reflect Mia saying that Sean Combs initiated sexual contact with her. But that was something that she had also testified to, where she said she didn't tell the government everything in those first initial meetings. However, I think the defense wanted to bring this stipulation that she kind of just withheld that and only brought it up later in the meetings that she had with the government. But I think what's more surprising is that she met with the government 31 times. That's a lot of times that she met with them. And then in terms of Vanna, her stipulation had to do with how her report, or how her meeting with the government didn't reflect Vanna stating that Sean Combs had told her that I can kill you at that photo shoot. And so then after all those stipulations were read for the jury to see, and after all those text messages were read once again for the jury to see, then the defense rested their case.
Yep, and that all went to credibility again for the jury to ultimately decide. So the defense, yes, officially rested their case. No witnesses called, including, like you mentioned, even a witness to rebut the testimony of Dr. Dawn Hughes, who was that forensic psychologist that testified the abuser-victim relationship can be quite complicated, and there's reasons that victims might stay with their abusers or speak highly of them or engage in behavior that looks inconsistent with being abused. But defense chose not to bring in an expert to rebut that testimony. Really interesting. So both sides rested. What can we expect for the rest of the week and leading into next week?
Yep. Well, unfortunately for everyone, there is no rebuttal case even for the government. So what's going to be happening next is they're going to have a big charge conference where they're going to talk about all the legal stuff in terms of the verdict forms, all of that stuff. Maybe people are interested in it. I'm definitely interested in it, so I will be there. But in terms of probably the next big day, that'll be closing arguments, which, I thought they were just going to be on Thursday, but it seems like, according to both sides, they might be Thursday and Friday, and not just maybe 4 hours for each side. It seems like they're expecting for it to go all day for both sides. So right now, the plan is for 9 to 5 p.m. on Thursday and Friday. And according to the government, they don't even think the jury will start deliberating until Monday. Now, in a perfect world, they say that the jury may start deliberating on Friday. But I think given just how big this case is, how much the stakes are in this case, I think both sides will want to take as much time as they need. So it looks like maybe jury deliberations won't even begin until Monday. So we'll wait and see, but we'll be here following this case day to day until we get that verdict, and probably even after.
That's even true. Okay, Elizabeth Millner, thank you so much. Get out of the heat. It's like 1,000 degrees outside. Really appreciate your fantastic reporting, as always.
Yes.
And that is all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.